Welcome to Restoration. I'm Rabbi Matt. So glad you can join us on this Shabbat. And we are getting extremely excited for the reintroduction of our weekly gatherings, which is coming in May. If you're a member or a regular attender, ask that you continue to pray with us, that God would give us wisdom and the best ways to open and for the best date to open. We're hopeful for the first Saturday of May. But as we get closer to that, there's all kinds of details that we're trying to work out with North Seattle Church and space that we share with different organizations. But we're excited after so long to be able, with restrictions, of course, with safety and social distancing, but we are excited to be able to gather together again soon. Also, we are in the days of the counting of Omer, the days between Passover and Shavuot. Today, April 17th, is the 20th day of the counting of the Omer. And the last 14 days of this, we're going to release a 14-day devotional and that Rabbi Ibars has been working hard on. And you'll receive some information if you have notifications turned on in the Restoration app, or if you're part of our email list. It'll be on social media, but we're going to ask everyone to participate in a 14-day devotional with us that will lead us to the day of Shavuot. And the day of Shavuot is Monday, May 17th. And we're not going to have a special service this year for the day of Shavuot, but we do encourage regular attenders and members of Restoration to request that day off of work. If you need a letter from me for your work, you can send an email to info@shalomseattle.com, and we will send you a letter to ask your boss to release you from work for the celebration of the giving of the Torah and the giving of the Holy Spirit. As we focus on getting our regular services, Shabbat gatherings back, we're not going to have a special service for that, but we encourage you to observe that special day. And as we go through these days of Omer, we started last week a new series called The Other Six, which are taking us through the last 6 of the 10 Commandments. We started the year with the series called Completely Other, where we talked about the first 4 commandments of the 10 Commandments. And if you didn't watch those, we encourage you to go back for some context. Now we're doing the other 6, which will take us right to the celebration of Shavuot. Some of you know as Pentecost, but it's the day in Jewish tradition that God gave the law to Moses, and also the day the Holy Spirit was given to the Jewish people in the temple courts in Acts chapter 2. So it made sense to focus on the 10 Commandments as we lead to the giving of the commandments. Leviticus 19 verse 1 says, Adonai spoke to Moses saying, "Speak to the congregation of the sons of Israel and tell them, you are to be completely other, for I, Adonai, your God, am completely other." And it's amazing, this word, completely other, because it's translated as holy in English, but really it means completely other. There's nothing in creation like God. We're made in his image, but we're not him. He's completely other from anything in creation. But he calls us, humanity, male and female together, he calls us completely other from everything in creation. And so he says, I want you to be completely other as I am completely other in creation. I want you to be completely other. And these are some of the ways you're going to be completely other, by keeping my commandments and doing these things. So last week we talked about verse 12, honor your father and mother, Exodus 20 and verse 12, honor your father and mother so that your days may be long in the land which Adonai your God is giving you. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not bear false witness against your neighbor. Do not covet your neighbor's house, your neighbor's wife, his manservant, his maidservant, his ox, his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's. And so these 6 commandments, the other 6, are our focus. I introduced a quote from my friend Pastor Tim Ross in last week's message on honor your father and mother, which is, Tim said to me in a conversation that I was having with him about my own counseling. He said, you medicate what you can't articulate. And it seems to me to be so true that there's so many things that we medicate or we soothe. We use to soothe things that we really don't even know what we're feeling. We don't even know. We're not paying attention. We look at problems as the problem, but there's a root to those problems that we medicate the things that we can't actually express. And it's important you understand from last week's message, but also from the prior series, Completely Other, that the Ten Commandments are broken into two groups. There's the love God side of the commandments, verse 4, and there's love people, the other 6. And so our focus is on the way Yeshua, our Messiah, broke down the commandments in Matthew 22, verse 37 to 40. He said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And this is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The entire Torah, all of the commandments, the prophets, hang on these two commandments. Because the setup from the beginning is every commandment either has to do with loving God or loving other people. A lot of times, you have to do with both. Like today's focus is Exodus chapter 20, verse 13. Simple words, do not murder. Of course, most people watching, hopefully most people watching, I'm sure there are some people watching who have, and we're glad you're watching, because God wants to bring everybody back to himself, no matter what people have done. But the truth is, there's a feeling for a lot of people where we read a verse like this and say, well, I'm good then. I never murdered anybody. Nailed it. Right? Check that one off. Never murdered anybody. You might remember that back in the first message of the Completely Other series, I did a whole message on how we're imitators of God, not impersonators of God. But a lot of things come down to our impersonation of God. We want to be like him. This is the nature of what we call the fall in Genesis chapter 3, when Adam and Eve were told not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and then they did. And then they experienced the ramifications of understanding good and evil, which God was trying to protect them from. You don't need to understand those things. But the serpent showed up and said, yeah, but why? Maybe God just doesn't want you to know all the things he knows. And Eve thought to herself, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what knowing would be like. So they ate, and sin was introduced into the world. And rather than being imitators, because we are made in God's image and we're like him, and he's gifted us to be the only thing in creation that is made in his image and is like him, rather than being content with being imitators, we become impersonators. And impersonators are people who believe that they're actually in control, that their decisions matter, that they alone have the understanding and the knowledge to help everybody understand how you could be. There is all kinds of applications for the idea of, in so many parts of our lives, we are designed to be imitators of God, but we become impersonators. We try to take his seat on the throne. We try to take his place as the God of all creation, and we make decisions like whether somebody should live or die. We take the image of God that everyone is created in as human beings. People decide that other people are not worth living, should be killed. Now, this is such a nuanced topic, and we could get into all kinds of things like war and peace and nations again. And is it for good and is it for evil? And you can get yourself all stuck in all kinds of nuance of conversation. But the real question I want to ask you, and I want to ask you to wrestle with whether you believe your answer is yes or no to this question. What are you so angry about? I think some of you are thinking to yourself, I'm not angry. I mean, she's angry. My wife's angry. My husband, he's angry. My kids are angry. I mean, everybody around me is angry, but I don't really wrestle. Or maybe you're a person and you hear that question, you think, gosh, I'm always angry. I don't know why I'm angry. I just know I'm angry. Some of you might even know some of the things that you're angry about, hurt and pain and abuse and people that have done awful things to you, and so you have reason to be angry. There are some things in our lives that we are justified to be angry about. There's anger, there's righteous anger, like there's justice in this world, and we have to wrestle with whether something is just or not. And when something is unjust, we should be angry. It should make us upset because injustice makes God angry. Yeshua has an interesting answer to this question in Matthew chapter 5, verse 21, which I talk about in my book, Jesus Never Said Anything New. Whenever I say that, the title of my book, Jesus Never Said Anything New, often people will say, well, but he said, you've heard, but I say. Yes, he did. And we're going to look at some of those over the next few weeks. But you've heard and I say is not, you've heard and what you heard is wrong, and what I say is right. He says, you have heard, Matthew chapter 5, verse 21, you have heard it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever commits murder shall be subject to judgment. I mean, that's a true statement. According to the Torah, the punishment for murder, death. If you murder somebody, you are subject to judgment. But Yeshua takes it a little deeper, and he says in verse 22, but I tell you that everyone who is angry with his brother is subject to judgment. Actually, whoever says to his brother, Raka, is subject to counsel. You know what? Even further, whoever says, you fool, is subject to fiery Gehenna. There's three different things here. The issue is not whether Yeshua is not saying, look, you've heard it said, you shall not murder, and I've come to tell you, it's totally cool. We're going to do this whole thing called the purge, and we're just going to give people a 24-hour period where you can just have vengeance on anybody you want, and there'll be no ramifications, and it'll be awesome, and everybody can just murder each other. He's saying, you've heard, if you murder, you're subject to judgment. But let me tell you who's subject to judgment. Because it's not just those who have actually taken the life of another person. You're subject to judgment if you're angry at your brother. I mean, this doesn't necessarily mean your brother, like your other brother, Daryl. It doesn't mean just your brother. It's saying if you're angry at someone, well, you're subject to judgment. Why would me being angry at someone else subject me to judgment? Because we do dumb things in our anger. In fact, I would argue, and I'm going to show you why Yeshua believes, and the whole of scriptures believe, that murder happens out of anger. Anger is a starting point. Judgment. And while most of the people who are currently angry are not going to actually take somebody's life, you're subject to judgment if you're angry at your brother. Why? Because you can't think about anything else. You can't do anything else. Whether justified or not, the anger that you're feeling internally, and probably that you felt since you were a child, anger that you've wrestled with your whole life, that you don't even really know exactly what you're angry about. I'm speaking from a place of a journey in my own healing. And there were things that I've been angry about my whole life that I didn't know that I was angry about. Because, well, you medicate, but you can't articulate. And so I started to soothe myself in ways that seemed to keep my emotions in check, but were really deepening anger over things I didn't even know I was angry about. And a lot of those things go back to 8, 10, 14 years old. That affect me to this day in the way that I think, in the way that I understand. And there's nobody on this planet that is not angry at somebody or something. And oftentimes the anger isn't even the emotion that we're supposed to be feeling. The anger is a defense mechanism often, so that we don't feel the thing that we actually need to feel, to grieve and to mourn and to be frustrated and feel the things we're supposed to feel, so that the anger dissipates. Yeshua says, I tell you that everyone who's angry with his brother is subject to judgment. Look, you're not subject to the judgment of death only if you murder somebody. We're already subject to judgment because we're angry. And he takes it even a step further, and he says, whoever says to his brother, Raka, shall be subject to the council. Now, this word Raka is probably an Aramaic word, and the Aramaic word, it's some believe, comes from the word to spit on. It's literally whoever says to his brother, like, you're the worst, and spits on him because you want nothing to do with him. It's the idea that you would curse somebody because of your anger. Well, you're subject to the council. Well, what's the council? Well, the council in first century Israel, Sanhedrin, a group of rabbis that had judgment. They didn't have a court system like we have a court system in the United States. They had the Sanhedrin, and it was the priesthood that made judgments on all kinds of issues and disagreements and crisis in people's lives. Yeshua is saying, if you curse your brother, if you spit on them, if you cut them off, if you want, you're not only subject to judgment, you're also subject to the judgment of the Sanhedrin. And even more so, if you call someone a fool, that person's just an idiot. I mean, I think about it because it happens every day when somebody cuts me off in Seattle traffic, and you say, that jerk, what an idiot. Like, one, they can't hear you. Two, there's no judgment that they're receiving on themselves for what they did. It's you placing a curse on someone else that affects you. It's the idea that the old adage of we drink bitterness is like drinking poison and believing it hurts the other person. No, it's just hurting you. And it's hurting your relationships, and it's hurting the way that you're angry. So we're not subject to judgment just because we murder people. We're subject to judgment because of the anger that we feel that leads to murder. It's a pattern, right? There's anger, and then that anger leads to cursing, and the cursing leads to calling other people names and holding on to that anger for the rest of your life. People in your life could bring up a particular name or a particular situation, and you all of a sudden are like, I hate that guy. He's the worst. And you go through this whole cycle of when chances are you haven't talked to that person, and you don't know what's happened to that person in their life since, and really anger that's eating at you. And the question is, what are you so angry about? As Jedi Grand Master Yoda once said, fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. And hate leads to suffering. But the suffering that hate leads to is internal. It's in you. You hating other people doesn't do what you think it does for you. It doesn't do anything good. And some of you, I said already, I don't really hate anyone. With compassion, I ask you to take it to the Lord. I remember David McQueen is a pastor in Abilene, and I'd asked him to mentor me a few years ago, and we would have 1 hour monthly conversations, and I'd work through some stuff with him, and he said, I got a book for you to read, and it's not a very good book, actually, but it has some good stuff in it. It's just not written very well. So I won't tell you the name of the book because that would be embarrassing to everybody. But one of the pages had this, who are you angry at? Pause and ask the Lord. And I said, I don't need to ask the Lord. I got 6 names. I wrote them down. Boom, 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 boom. One of the names on that list was another Messianic rabbi named Bob Solomon, founder of Beth Hillel in Georgia. And I tell you his name because of what the Lord did. I, first of all, didn't have to pray about it because I already knew. And 2 weeks later, after writing that list with Robert Solomon at the top of that list, his son Kevin, who now leads a congregation in Atlanta, called me and said, I know this is super random and I'm having some stuff going on, but do you think it would be possible for you to come preach at my congregation in like 2 weeks? And I literally said to the Lord in my mind, really? Like, I just wrote his name down and this is how you're going to. So I said, of course, love to come. And I went and I spent time with Kevin. It was such a great trip, and they have service on Friday and a service on Saturday, and I preached same message twice, and Robert was there in the back row, and I felt like the Lord said to me, you need to honor him in the house that I asked him to build. So I started the message and I said, before I jump into the sermon, I just want you to know, to those who were there that evening and morning, that you're part of a great congregation. Your Rabbi Robert and Miss Dottie, who passed away not too long ago, but was still alive then. You don't know how blessed you are to have people who followed the call of God in their lives and established one of the first Messianic communities, even own their own building in modern Messianic Judaism. I just honored, and I heard the Lord. I thought, I just need to honor them in their own synagogue. And on Friday night, as I opened with that, I very clearly heard the Lord right before I had to preach, which was frustrating. But can you not talk to me now? I'm like, and the Lord just said, now I can break you. I can break bitterness in you. And then I preached. And then I repeated it again Saturday. And I felt like, without even fully understanding it in the moment, being able to process it all these years later, felt like I needed to honor them because of the dishonor I felt in my heart for things he didn't even really know that he did, different situations that I was just angry about from when I was a kid. And I didn't need to go and tell him. It's kind of like, whenever people preach messages like this, I went to a Christian college, so we have chapel every day, and people would come. I felt like this happened like 6 times in all 4 years of college. And somebody would get up and be like, if you have a problem with your brother, you need to go tell them. And then at the end of the message, somebody would come up to me and say, I just need you to know that I have hated you all the years that we've been in school together. And I really felt like I had to get that burden off my heart and ask you to forgive me. And I'd be like, yeah, I forgive you. But you don't have to actually ask people to forgive you for things they don't even know about. The issue's you. You just need to work it out between you and the Lord. And the Lord worked it out. And it was, Dave McQueen, read this book. The book, Who Are You Angry At? Oh, stupid Pete. I'll just write the list. And then God gave me an opportunity to do something with it. And honoring the person that I've been angry at for all these years, God then said, now I can do something with you. So, if I could ask you, if you're one of the people who would think, I don't hate anyone, would you just take it to the Lord? Even the way we're talking about it, I don't think I hate anybody, but is there something I'm holding on to that I've never let go of that's like poison in my body? And is there something you want to do with it? Because if you don't, you medicate what you can't. I think there's other people listening too who are just always angry. You have no idea what you're angry about. And you don't have to argue like me. Somebody says, you're angry, and you're like, I know. You're my whole life, huh? But why are you angry? It's interesting when we talk about calling somebody a fool, the idea that Yeshua is saying, don't curse your brother, because if you curse your brother, you're subject to judgment. It's actually in Proverbs 15, verse 5. It says, a fool despises his father's discipline, but one who accepts reproof is smart. Remember in the first message of the series, Father 6, honor your father and mother. It's the setup. We honor our father and mother, even if the only good thing they did was give us life. There's honor because it took 3 people to create you, God and your mother and father. And the life that you have is worth honoring their lives. It says, verse 8 of the same proverb says, sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination to the Lord, but the prayer of the upright pleases him. And there's all through the Proverbs, there's the difference of there's people who are fools, and there's people who are people of wisdom. And people of wisdom, we talked about last week, are people who know how to receive correction, who can receive correction. The first verse in Proverbs 15 says, a gentle answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. The tongue of the wise treat knowledge correctly, but the mouth of fools spout folly. Like, we are fools and we don't even know we're fools. And it's just easier for us to say, what an idiot. That person's such a fool. They're the worst. I hate that person. Well, really, all you're actually dealing with is that you're a fool. You can't receive correction. And the proverb, verse 8, is the sacrifice of the wicked is abomination. There's always, when it comes to the wise and the fool and anger and correction, it always comes back to sacrifice. And it's such a weird concept. It's why does it always come back to sacrifice? But Yeshua continued when he was talking about murder, and he said, verse 23, Matthew 5, if you're presenting your offering on the altar, there's only one, it's in Jerusalem, the temple at that time, and you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your offering before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, then come and present an offering. There's a couple things that are interesting about this sentence. One, he jumps from anger into offerings. You're angry. You shouldn't be angry. You know you shouldn't murder, but you have anger in your heart, so you're subject to the same judgment. So when you make an offering on the altar, it's interesting to think about in first century Israel, the only altar that you would make an offering on is in Jerusalem. So if you're a Jewish person like Yeshua from the Galilee, you would travel all the way from the Galilee, many days to travel, and to make sacrifices on the altar. How frustrating would it be to get all the way to Jerusalem and be in the spot where you already went through all the cleanliness rituals, that you go through all the things. It's like this huge trip. It's taking you like 7 days to get there. You got to go get a mikvah. You got to do the whole, there's all this process, and you get to the altar and you're like, I sinned against. And Yeshua is saying, if that comes to your mind, you should leave the offering there. Go. Be reconciled to your brother. Like, leave your offering in Jerusalem. Go all the way home. There's a 7-day trip. You need to go tell the person that you just realized that you sinned against them and that you're sorry. Reconcile with your brother, then come back and present your offering. Why? Because Proverbs 15, verse 8. The sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination to the Lord. And even if we are people who believe in Yeshua and are not wicked, the anger has kept us in a place where God won't receive your offering. Are you telling me, Rabbi Matt, that God won't receive my offerings? Well, I mean, I'm not telling you. The Bible is. Don't be angry at me. Talking about anger. First be reconciled to your brother. It's funny, it should say the opposite, I think. If you remember that somebody has an issue against you, go reconcile. No, it's not what it says. It says if you realize that your brother has something against you because you sinned against someone else, then it's your responsibility to reconcile with that person. Because We want God to receive our offering. It's funny, when we talk about the idea Jesus never said anything new, it's in these moments, you understand Jewish context, that Yeshua never says the names Cain and Abel in Matthew 5 when he's talking about murder. But everyone who was there thought of Cain and Abel. If a Jewish person today, if you hear the story of if you're angry and there's murder and then there's an offering, you think Genesis chapter 4. Because the first murder happened over anger, over an offering. It's a 16-verse story that really repeats the same thing that happened to Adam and Eve, not in the murder, but in their fall and their desire to become God, to move from imitators to impersonators. Cain and Abel is another retelling of the same exact situation. So, in talking about this offering, Yeshua brings to mind Cain and Abel for those who are listening to him. And if you look at the verses in Genesis chapter 4, you actually see that this is the first place in Hebrew that the word for sin is even used. Not used in the story of Adam and Eve. It is used in the story of their children, Cain and Abel. Genesis 4, verse 2, we're just going to read all 16 verses, get the context of the whole story, which helps you understand. It really, to understand the context, this is how Jewish context works of the New Testament. To understand the context of 10 verses in Matthew chapter 5, you need the context of 16 verses from the book of Genesis. Right? You can't just read the New Testament and apply it without knowing what he's talking about. Everyone there already had these 16 verses on their mind, even to the point where he doesn't have to say it or talk about it, they just understand. So it says in Genesis chapter 4, verse 2, Eve gave birth again to Abel. She'd already had the eldest Cain, and Abel became a shepherd of the flocks, while Cain became a worker of the ground. So it happened after some time that Cain brought an offering of fruit to the ground to the Lord, while Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and their fat portions. Now Adonai looked favorably upon Abel and his offering, but upon Cain and his offering he did not look favorably. Cain became very angry, and his countenance fell, which in Hebrew just means his face fell, which means he was like... Now, it's weird, right? Because in these verses, we don't know why God accepts Abel's offering and why he doesn't accept Cain's. We can make guesses, and there's lots of guesses and opinions of why. But I don't think why he accepts the offering or doesn't accept one offering is the point of the story. The point of the story is, why was Cain angry? God says, it says Cain became angry and his countenance fell. And then the Lord said to Cain in Genesis 4, verse 6, he said to Cain, why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, it will lift. If you do not do well, sin is crouching at the doorway, and its desire is for you, but you must master it. Interesting question. I think we know the answer. Why are you angry, Cain? Well, because you didn't accept my offering. The question that should follow from Cain is, why didn't you accept my offering? To which God would have most likely given him an answer. See, I don't think God's angry here. God's not saying, why are you so angry, idiot? He's saying, I don't understand what you're angry about. And it could have been easy for Cain just to say, well, I'm angry because you accepted Abel's offering, but you didn't accept mine. I don't understand. Why didn't you accept mine? But none of that happened. And the Lord warns him. He says to him, look, if you do the things you're supposed to do, your countenance will lift up. Like, you'll be okay. I don't hate you. I'm not against you. I'm not trying to make your life awful, but there's a reason I didn't accept it. So you should probably ask, why didn't I accept your offering? Because sin is crouching at the doorway, and its desire is for you. But you must master it. And it's interesting because this word for sin in Hebrew actually means to miss the mark. Translated sin. Sin is crouching at your door. but its means to miss the mark or fall short. So there's an expectation in giving offerings. I could spend all day talking about, oh man, how did they even know to give offerings? Torah hasn't been given yet. And how does Abel know how to give the fat portions? And why do they know the things that they seem to know? Like God must have had conversations with them and told them what to do. Like there's more to the story than they already know some things that they shouldn't know because the commandments haven't been given yet, but they seem to know it. But he's angry because God didn't receive it. So why are you angry? God's question. He says to Cain, sin, missing the mark, is crouching at your doorway. And its desire is for you. But you must master it. It's the same idea when the serpent came to Eve and said, did God really say you would die if you eat of all the trees? Of course, that's not what God said. God said if you eat of this tree, you will die. And did God mean they'll drop dead? No, he meant the knowledge of good and evil is a bummer. You don't need to know all that. I'll just do that. It was love and compassion. But we wanted to be like him. We wanted to be imitators. We moved from imitators to impersonators and decided, well, I want to know what this whole knowledge of good and evil is. And then you get the knowledge of good and evil, and it's such a bummer because of all the outcomes of how good and evil play out in this world. It says, desire, sin of missing the mark, it's gunning for you. Desire is for you, wants to kill you, destroy you. I'm not giving you what you need to master it. Verse 8, Cain spoke to his brother Abel, and while they were in the field, Cain rose up against Abel, his brother, and first murder. Creation. From people to people. God and I said to Cain, where's your brother, Abel? It's like when his parents were first understood they were naked, they hid, and God, they used to walk with God, and they're hiding, and God says, where are you? Like he knew where they were. They're like hiding in a bush, and he's like, I see you. Kids are little, and they're like, everybody hide, and they just close their eyes and sit there. You're like, because your eyes are closed, it doesn't mean I can't see you. He says, where is your brother? I don't know. What am I, in charge of my brother? God's like, yeah. Well, you were. And he said, Cain, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying out to me. Now, cursed are you from the ground. Which in Hebrew, the word ground, where we get Adam's name. It's Adamah, it's dust. It's pretty hard to be a farmer and have the ground cursed from you. And it opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand, and as often as you work the ground, will not yield its crops to you. You will be a restless wanderer. God was like, Cain, I know you're angry. Just listen to me. You're going to miss the mark. And when you miss the mark, you're going to get angry. And sin is crouching at the door trying to destroy you. But you can master it. Don't let it master you. You can master it. You master over it. And he goes immediately from there and kills his brother. Why would he even kill his brother? Well, comparison. God rejected his offering but accepted Abel's. It must have been Abel's fault. This is how my kids argue now. I'm sure it's how I argued when I was a kid. Well, still sometimes. Laura and I were having a fight recently, and I literally stomped my feet. And she was like, are you throwing a tantrum? God says to Cain, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying out for me from the ground. There's an injustice that happened. And God's aware of injustice. He knows it happens. And it's interesting that of the two voices he hears, Cain's anger, he hears the voice of Abel's blood crying out to him from the ground. And it's amazing because the story ends with Cain says, look, okay, I'm going to be a wanderer. I get it. Verse 14, you expelled me today from the face of the Adam, of the ground, and I must be hidden from your presence, but I'll be a restless wanderer on the earth. But anyone who finds me is going to kill me. Verse 15 says, but Adonai said to him, in that case, anyone who kills Cain is to be avenged 7 times over. So God put a mark on Cain so that anyone who found him would not strike him down. And then verse 16, the end of the story of Cain and Abel. And Cain left Adonai's presence and dwelled in the land of wandering. Some of your translations say the land of Nod. The word Nod is wandering, the land of Noddering, which is east of Eden. Oh man, this is so cool. The Garden of Eden is in a place called Eden. It's not all Eden. Eden is an area. In Eden, there's a garden. When Adam and Eve sinned against the Lord, he shut them out. He exiled them from the garden. He didn't exile them from Eden. But here, he exiles Cain from all of Eden. He tells him to go east of Eden. Anywhere in the Hebrew scriptures, when the people of Israel go east, it's because we're going into exile. Because we didn't do what God told us to do. He sends us into exile. Not permanently, not forever, but so that to give us an opportunity to return. But he sends us to a period of exile. It happens again and again through the Hebrew scriptures. It's the whole idea that we are wandering, and God has set up systems to help us understand why we're wandering, that in our wandering, he would call us back to himself and we would return to his presence, to him. So he sends him to a land of wandering east of Eden. And he continues his wandering, and the story gets so much worse for humanity all the way to the flood in Genesis. In Genesis 11, it keeps repeating and repeating and repeating this story of God speaks, and then somebody they miss the mark, they sin, and then there's judgment, and then they're exiled, and then they build a tower to try to beat God, and then God makes a covenant with Abraham. It's through covenant that he makes with Abraham that he sends a promise of a Savior who would come as the ground is crying out. And Yeshua, our Messiah, spills his own blood, makes himself a sin offering. Same Hebrew word as sin in Genesis, the sin offering. Makes himself a sin offering so that we can come home, that we can stop wandering. There's some, in the Pacific Northwest, the difference for me growing up in New York is people value wandering here. There's stickers on people's cars that are talking about hiking, but it says all who wander are not lost, because some people just like to wander in the creation and enjoy it. The truth is, we're all lost. It's not like the saved and the lost, two groups. We're all wandering east of Eden. And God's speaking to us like he spoke to Cain. And he's saying to us, why are you so angry? Well, this happened and this happened and this happened. And God's like, I know, I was there. The ground cries out to me. I know. Why are you angry? Well, because there's all this injustice, and there's people, and there's these viewpoints, and there's all these different things, and it makes me so angry when people disagree with me and tell me I'm wrong, but really there's idiots because they can't see what I see. Why are you so angry, though? Because nobody listens to me. Everybody argues with me. I feel like I can't, I'm trying to get attention from people, but nobody's listening. Okay, so why are you so angry? It's like this question. It's the joke of counseling in everything about counseling. where the counselor says, somebody, how does that make you? And we laugh about it like that's all counselors say. Gosh, there's so many times in counseling, my counselor asked me a question like that. I have no idea how I feel. My response is maybe you should figure that out. Instead of just existing in anger, where is the anger coming from? We medicate, but we can't articulate. God has given us everything we need to be able to articulate things that we're running away from. They're keeping us stuck in our anger. And it's why he's saying through the story of Cain and Abel, I know most of us haven't murdered people, and that's good. But we're already subjects to judgment because of anger we feel. And that anger is hurting you more than it's hurting anybody else. And you're wandering east of Eden, lost. Even many of us are followers of Yeshua and we're saved and we are not lost. But we're lost because we're not taking the time to figure out. We're not using the resources that are available to us through community and counseling and other things that can help us understand exactly why we feel so lost, because it's the presence of God or it's exile. We're all stuck in exile, angry that God exiled us. I need you to at least put a mark on me. And this is so interesting because this idea of the mark of Cain has played itself out in so many ways in history. There were some church fathers that said the mark of Cain was black skin. It was the justification for slavery, black people. There are some theologians, church fathers, who said the Jewish people had the mark of Cain and were cursed for judgment. And the whole time, God's just looking at every person going, it's so easy to say, well, it's because they got the mark of Cain. Like, you have the mark of Cain. Why are you so angry? It doesn't mean the things that you're angry about aren't justified. It just means you don't have to stay there. And I feel like so many of the struggles that we have in our current culture and in our world are rooted in anger. There's a deeper reason why people are feeling the things that they're feeling, and it plays out in all of these different ways and all of these different social issues and politics and religion and all of these different areas. I have this friend from high school who just constantly on Facebook, constantly saying things against, like blasphemous things against Jesus and against Christians and mocking believers for praying. And recently it was my birthday and he wrote, everybody says happy birthday. He wrote happy birthday and I wrote, thanks, man. I'm praying for you, just to laugh. I knew he'd laugh. But like, what puts you in a place? It would be one thing for him just to say, I don't believe in that stuff. I think it's nonsense. Okay. But why every day you have to express anger towards a very specific part of the population? Could it be that somebody who said they followed Jesus hurt you? And so you don't want to follow Jesus? And the truth is, you're the one wandering in exile, and he's made every effort to welcome you home, call you back to himself, not to be like that person who hurt you, but to be different, be completely other. So easy, this group and that group. And I think all like the root of racism and the root of nationalism is always comes down to, I think it's interesting because it always comes down to the justification for oppression and murder. Often plays out as, well, they're not really people, whatever the people are. Jews aren't really people. Black people aren't really people. Whatever your group is, well, they're not really people. And the only way that we can justify what we know is not good, you just say, well, they're not one of us. When God's between the two, the voice that God hears crying out is the blood that's on the ground. And his response, why you trying to set you free from your anger. He's trying to set you free from the life of wandering, trying to call you back into presence. So you've heard it said, you shall not murder, and who commits murder shall be subject to judgment. That's true. But I tell you that everyone who's angry, brother, subject to judgment, and whoever says to his brother, Raka, subject to the Sanhedrin, and whoever says, you fool, subject to the fiery Gehenna. So, instead of being stuck in that land of wandering, do this instead. Therefore, you're presenting your offering upon the altar, and you remember that your brother has something. So you just leave the offering there before the altar. First, be reconciled to your brother. Present. And then, God will love offering. Do something. Person. Acknowledge it. You just celebrate, I'm not a murderer, yay, I'm a good person. Celebrate that I'm subject to judgment of a murderer. But God, in his grace and mercy, receives me and my offering and calls me to be a person who protects sanctity of life. Doesn't just not murder people, but does everything they can to avoid anger. It's going to happen. It happens. We get hurt and we get angry. Stop running from it. Deal with it. God wants to receive your offering. Wants. Welcome. Let me pray for you. Lord God, we thank you. You are a God of mercy and compassion. All the mess of our lives in this world, that messy place, you made a way for us to deal with things that we are afraid to deal with, things that we're afraid to acknowledge, the things that we're afraid to even see. You come to us face to face. Welcome us. No matter what we've done, no matter where we come from. You want to receive our offering. You want to help break through our anger. You are a good God. So great ever. Next week, we're going to talk about why having sex with people other than your spouse is terrible. See you next week.